Okay. Whoa, we're running late, and I'm starting late, and half of you aren't here, but we have a lot of announcements to get through today. I think what I'll do is I'll pile stuff up here on the corner and draw your attention to the fact that we've got these talks coming up, and we have these very beautiful postcards for the Meta Center Open House that's taking place in 2 weeks. Yeah, come on up, Jordan. I have about 3 or 4 paper prospectuses, actually 5 or 6, which I'll also leave here. So if you haven't gotten yours back yet, come up and get it at the end of the class. And to remind you, those papers are due the last class meeting, which I think is the 7th of May, something like that. So there was some confusion. Some people thought that they were doing the final exam, and unfortunately that's not true. One announcement I'd like to make to everybody, Seishi, do you mind if I tell people what you're writing on? If I can do that? I didn't give him much of a choice today. This is very heartwarming for me because Seishi comes here from Togo, which is a country that has had a long-running dictatorship, one of the longest and least pleasant dictatorships in Africa. And when he left Africa to come here, he thought that the only way to dislodge it was through armed struggle. And now guess what? He's beginning to think that this stuff might make some sense. So I'm saying this might be the most important paper that you ever write, and the most important one that we ever get in this class. And I have a resource for you. Next door to you, country of Benin, they're having some interesting experiments with democracy. And you have a long border with Benin. There's two long, thin countries. It might be easy to move some of that stuff over. So this is in the New Internationalist, which is a journal that I recommend anyway. If I could get that back, Taco, when you're finished. Okay. Let's see. First of all, I really liked our conversation on Tuesday, and I'd like to just take a minute and see if there's any follow-up. Anybody done any more thinking about the situation with the Sarayaku? That was a situation with a kind of momentary or situational resistance people hadn't prepared for. And as somebody pointed out, I remember it was roughly in this part of the room, but I remember who it was. Somebody pointed out there wasn't much continuity after the successful resistance. They brought the soldiers in, they talked to them, they changed their minds around, gave them back their weapons and sent them back out. But by and large, not much that's structurally different. So by the time I'm finished today, I'm going to talk about and show you some material about a movement in a similar part of the world, working on a similar issue that constructed itself a little bit differently, but it's been going on for more than 20 years. And that's the MST. But before we get there, and the part I'm not going to be able to cover, I'm afraid, is going through the readings that were in the reader. I had a few things I wanted to point out about that, and maybe we'll get back to it next week. So, any follow-up from Tuesday's discussion? Have you been issues that we touched upon that you're thinking about? a dramatic introduction for your question. That will be your theme song. If not, let me, and of course, you could come back on later if it occurs to you. I wanted to respond to a few things that John Lindsay Poland brought up in his talk about FOR presence in Colombia. First of all, I wanted to emphasize something that he almost wasn't going to mention, except somebody asked him, which is how many people constitute the Fellowship of Reconciliation Latin American Task Force presence in Colombia. And the astounding fact, as you remember, that it's 5 people. And I feel, in a way, really good about this because this gives us a way to measure, if you will, the power of nonviolence. If you remember from Pax 164A, I was fond of quoting that remark made by the last Viceroy of India, who said that when a city erupts in rioting, I have 2 choices. I can send a brigade of 10,000 heavily armed troops, or one little brown man who doesn't even have any teeth, and they both have exactly the same effect. From his point of view, there's a quelling the violence. So do the math. 1 NV equals 10,000 V. V equals 1 over, I don't know, you'll have to take it from there. Similarly, and we've done several of these comparative examples before, we stacked up the Indian freedom struggle against the Algerian one, all of which is starting to remind me that I also had some other announcements to mention. One of them was about 2 resources that I'm going to send you by CourseWeb very soon, as soon as I get back to my office. In fact, one of them is a documentary film called neither of them is a documentary film, cross that out. It's a study called Does Terrorism Work? 2 people who have stacked up a whole series of armed versus unarmed resistance movements, which are comparable from one way or another. And who wants to take a quick guess at what the answer is? No. Very good, Catherine. Yeah. This is what they would call in Greece Oki Day. It's our no day. No, terrorism does not work compared to unarmed resistance. The other is a very interesting carryover from you remember when we studied the Otpor uprising in Belgrade, I said this was unique from a couple of points of view. One is this is the first time the United States government had supported a nonviolent anything, in this case a nonviolent insurrection. So that's an eye-opener. Maybe even more importantly, there's a direct flow-through of educational process in this movement, and that has been rare up until recently, and this could make a tremendous difference. This could be a qualitative quantum leap forward for nonviolence in the world, where people found themselves in a struggle, didn't know exactly what to do. They went and found out. What a concept. You can go get some materials translated and learn how to do it. Once they learned how to do it, they figured they could package it. Actually, they didn't do that themselves. That was the International Center for Nonviolent Conflict in Washington, D.C. packaged this as a group called Canvas. And I found out from the second article I wanted to tell you about that Canvas has a website, which is Canvasopedia. And that's appropriate because pedia is actually from the Greek word paideia, meaning education. So that's appropriate for us. What they've done is first they packaged what they had learned there and started to take it to all the color revolutions in different parts of Europe. But now they're taking it all over the world, and it's recently been applied in Papua New Guinea, where there's a long-term struggle going on against Indonesian and against U.S. Interference of various kinds. I can't imagine where that little yellow thing went with my other announcements, but I remember one announcement I wanted to make was that I might have to miss Tuesday's class, in which case I'll get it covered. But the point is that there's going to be probably during that period a showing, a premiere of a new documentary on Abdul Ghaffar Khan. And you know how the people of Los Angeles feel about film premieres. So I'm probably going to have to wear a tuxedo and be driven up in a sedan with limo and all the things, the lights. And if that's true, I will get it filmed and bring it back here and we'll spend the day watching it. But seriously, if I do have to go down there, I'll let you know by CourseWeb. I'll arrange for something else to happen. Okay, so the other second piece of reading I'm going to send you is rather long, I'm afraid, but it's a detailed report of training that's been carried out by an organization called Peace Workers. I'm actually, for better or for worse, I'm the chairman of their board and we're having a meeting this afternoon, but they have been encouraging and systematically training the Papuan people to carry out their resistance, discovering that they had to resist. They had to carry out horizontal nonviolence before they could carry out vertical nonviolence, which is roughly what we mean by constructive program versus obstructive program. They had to get their own act together before they could have an effective presence. Okay, so I can't at the moment remember why I was talking about that in this context, but I started to talk about things that I wanted to cite from John Lindsay Poland's talk, and one of them was that you had this, oh yeah, I remember the connection now. You can put together these examples to show how incredibly more effective it is in terms of personnel, money, and injury risk factors to do things by nonviolence than it is to do the same thing through violence. And I suppose by now we're pretty used to that idea, but it's really good to have some of these cases at our fingertips because most of the world still is not like us. After this webcast, of course, everything will be different. And did I mention last week that, or Tuesday, that the webcast can now be gotten to directly through the medicine? Okay. Okay, so yeah, 5 people making such a tremendous difference in Colombia at one point in Guatemala, where you had one of the more dramatic results of nonviolent intervention because it led to establishing a space where the opposition groups could function, and that in turn led to a peace process. We're not saying that the peace process is still in effect and that Guatemala is a happy country right now, but at least it was given the chance by Peace Brigades International, and I think the most that PBI ever had there was probably 6 or 8 people, and at one point I know for a fact it was down to one guy who was able to do that. Another thing that John mentioned struck me very forcibly because he said that he had gone to some of the people in this peace camp. I think it was San Jose de Apartado, which is the best known one, and they said, we want you to come here not to protect us. They said, we're going down and we don't want to go down alone. We want somebody there to witness us. It struck me because when I met John Lindsay Poland was at a meeting in the early days of third-party nonviolent intervention. We did not have nonviolent peace force, was not even a gleam in Mel Duncan and David Hartso's eyes at that point. We had a meeting in Santa Cruz. One of the people there was Mubarak Awad, who was a Palestinian, who started the Palestinian Center for the Study of Nonviolence. And we asked him, do you want us to come? We knew he was doing some very intense stuff. People were getting killed. Do you want us to come and be with you? And he said, yes, we want you there. Don't tell us what to do. Just come. He said, we definitely want you there. We are not afraid to die, but we do not want to die alone. So this just struck me on the emotional level. Sometimes you kind of stumble into the power of protective accompaniment and other dimensions of third-party nonviolent intervention. You go there just to be a moral witness for somebody, just to sort of hold their hand, if you will, metaphorically. And you discover that your presence has protective power. That's exactly how PBI got started in Nicaragua. They went down there to document the results of what was being called in those days low-intensity conflict. It's one of the nice euphemisms for killing people slowly enough that it wouldn't get up over the radar. A big deal. And they went down there to document that. And they stayed in a village like Jalapa, which was almost on the border with Honduras, where the Contra were coming over all the time. Then when they got back to their comfortable homes in Marin, sitting around drinking their lattes, they realized that while they were in the village, nobody had been killed. And they came to the realization that they had to turn around and go back there. Not for the purpose of documenting, which is sort of a formal way of saying witnessing, but for the purpose of protecting with their presence. And I've written about that in Search for a Nonviolent Future. So we're at such an early stage with the awareness of nonviolence that people are stumbling upon it through serendipity, and we could accelerate things a lot by making more education available, which is what a lot of us in this class are already doing. He also touched on a topic that's useful for us to be aware of. You go to these remote villages. Remember he's talking about bouncing on his Jeep going up into the mountains for hours. Come to this village. The people in that village have zero opportunity to influence policy, even in Bogota, not to mention the United States. One of the things that third-party interveners can be is a link in the chain of nonviolence. We've mentioned this phrase before, the great chain of nonviolence. Often people on the ground who have no representation at the policy level can concatenate their way up there through a series of connections. So that, remember we talked about Hildegard Dossmeyer having that function among others in the Philippines. So that's a very important thing that you can be by being down there is you can carry the message up to policy level. And I've seen a film, I don't propose to show it to us, but one of the early films that PBI made shows PBI workers going into a village and talking to the army personnel to introduce themselves, say here's who we are, here's why we're here. But in the course of doing that, they immediately give the villagers and the others who are under threat connections to the wider world. Okay, then the one remaining thing, I think I'm forgetting one, so if I leap up and shut off the video and say, sorry guys, I'll bring it up to you. But there's one other, this is really sort of the main thing. You may remember that at one point, John said, Michael isn't going to like this. You might have wondered what that was about. He was one of these deep, bitter conflicts in the peace movement. No, it's not like that. What he was referring to is he was about to give you an explanation of how protective accompaniment works. And whenever I hear PBI people do it, and originally I knew him when he was in PBI. When I hear PBI doing this, I say yes, but, and I add another dimension. So they've come to think that I don't actually like their explanation. It's not like that at all. My sister was married to one of their explanations. No, it's perfectly reasonable to treat people as, and I'm going to use the social science term for this, self-interest maximizers. You can treat people as though they were rational. No advertiser is fool enough to do anything like that, and no politician really is fool enough to do anything like that, because they know that we have this very narrow surface of rationality and self-interest calculation. Underneath that, we have much deeper motives, which are both better and worse. We have deeply selfish, vicious drives going on down there. That's why we all have to meditate and stuff. But we also have, and science is just beginning to discover this, we have these incredible selfless impulses that nobody knows how to tap into. Nobody knows how to sell us bubblegum on the basis of these things, so they don't get advertised. But the example that's come back to my mind recently, and I've been thinking about, is after the tsunami that hit Southeast Asia in 2004, there was a Marine who was in there doing relief work. It was dangerous. He was seeing a lot of horrible stuff. And he was interviewed at the end of the day, literally at the end of a very hard day of rescuing people and handing out food and stuff. And they asked him how he felt about what he was doing. He said, I have been serving my country. That's how you refer to military practice. Okay, I'm not going to quarrel with that part. I've been serving my country for 30 years and I never got a day's fulfillment out of it until today. So John says that, okay, these people, and I'm partly plugging in details from other conversations I've had with him. The hit squad comes into a town, a village, they've been told to get somebody. They knock on the door, they're ready to break in. The door opens, uh-oh, there's a gringo standing there, or a gringa. And the jefe didn't tell them that this was going to happen. They don't know what to do. They don't have orders for that. So they go back. So that's sort of just on the rational level, you see. Now, the jefe who's sending out these hit squads, they come to know that what's happening is being observed. And like, for example, even in Colombia, where it doesn't seem like there's any limit to the damage rule. Oh, that reminds me. I got it back. Thanks, guys. Okay, we'll get there in a second. If I forget, just go like this, because it has to do with the number 20. Okay. The people who are sending out these hit squads, they are comfortable operating in darkness, undercover. I mean, they just have their people drive up on a motorcycle, 2 people, one of them jumps off, bang, 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 back on the motorcycle, you disappear. That's all fine. But if somebody knows who you are and what you're doing, if this is witnessed, then you can really lose standing as a country that is eligible for human rights on the basis of its human rights record for international funding. Right? So it is U.S. law that we cannot fund organizations like the paramilitaries in Colombia. That's not legal to do according to U.S. law, should anybody care to look at the legality of this. So we fund the government and the army, and it takes about 5 minutes worth of money to get over to the paramilitaries. But even that constitutes a kind of deterrence, that if everybody knew that this was happening, the government might lose funding. I started in my chapter in Search for a Nonviolent Future with this episode about Karen Ridd, how she was picked up along with 4 others, and it turned out that El Salvador had trade agreements with Canada. Karen Ridd is a Canadian. Canadian government gets on the phone and says, you have one of our people. Give her back or we have no trade agreement anymore. So all of this is true and it is happening, and I don't deny it, and it's not true that, quote, Michael doesn't like it. It's just that Michael isn't satisfied with it. Michael is a hard person to satisfy. Michael wants to say that even in these, trying not to use a 4-letter word, even in these people who have been so dehumanized that they can jump off the back of a motor scooter and shoot you 10 times and drive away without thinking about it, even in such a person, there is a conscience. If there were not, we would not be really in business in this course. So I'm saying that while all of this rational calculation is going on, under the surface, there's also a human response that's going on. And the dynamic of that is very simple. If you have a target, if a person has become a target in your mind, you're going to do something to that person, there's another person there, suddenly it's not just a duality anymore. This introduces a disturbing element, and if that third person is there risking their life to protect the person that you had been about to kill, it awakens your humane awareness that that was a fellow human being there. Now, I am willing to go this far with the self-interest maximizers of the world. This doesn't always, quote, work. You are not always in a position to reach people enough to awaken them up so that they won't pull the trigger. But it will always do work, right? It will always affect things and change it for the better. So all I'm saying is why don't we acknowledge both of these levels of human motivation and build on them. You know, Mike, did you want to ask something before I get to my remaining point? Yeah. Well, sometimes, for example, when this probably the most notorious massacre took place at Acteal in Chiapas, people, or John actually also mentioned a case where paramilitaries were attacking somebody and there was an army helicopter circling overhead. Now, if you come out, you observe that helicopter, you write down the number, and you simply call it in on your cell phone to headquarters in Bogota. They release it to the press, or what have you. So it goes. It's not that there's a lot of accountability or they catch the people who have actually done the murders. If you make the mistake of victimizing a North American person, then like those 5 nuns in El Salvador, then you might get in trouble. Zoe? Okay. Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, so now my one remaining thing. This is so satisfying. Can't tell you. I heard a talk, and so did John and Lindsay Poland actually at the same event, with the late lamented Senator Paul Wellstone, who had spent some time in Colombia. Had a lot of interesting stories to tell. One of the things he told us was that they had done a study of how much money it would take to persuade a Colombian peasant not to grow coca. And it turned out that if you gave a peasant dollars not to grow coca, it cost 1/20th of what it cost to eradicate the coca after he or she had grown it. So we could be getting 20 times more non-bang for the buck and not be doing those horrible things to the ecosystem that John was talking about, which is futile anyway, because as he was saying, they just move over to another field and plant it. And there's horrible cases of what these chemicals have done to plants, animals, and people. And even the economy of it doesn't make sense. We could be 20 times more effective if we would go in and just give the peasants a subsidy. But of course, you never do that. Never give an indigenous person a break. That's the name of the game. Paolo? You get that? Yeah, you know, the fact is that Senator Wellstone is no longer with us. I don't know how we can track that down, but I do think that John Lindsay Poland might know it because those two went on and had a deep conversation after that. Yeah, so you could ask him. He's in the FOR office in Oakland. Hmm?
I'm just wondering what about the sentiment value of the plant for the peasants. I mean, the plant itself
well,
is less strong than coffee, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I don't think that if you gave them the money, they wouldn't grow coca, but they wouldn't grow it as an export cash monocrop. That's what we're saying. Right now, they're depending on it to get above subsistence. That's all.